Hi guys, welcome back to another tutorial. This is the first tutorial of the summer and it is for this Dahlia Bolero. This is the one that I made in the video. It is kind of like this accessory piece made for sleeveless tops or dresses, just to give you that little bit of extra coverage. I really hate the feeling of sunscreen on my skin. I know you really should be wearing it, and like 90% of the time I do, but sometimes if I know I'm not going to be in the sun that much, I'm still kind of getting coverage from the sun. This is relatively a beginner friendly project. The only thing I will say is if you are more on the beginner side of the beginner to intermediate sewing level range, pick a cotton or a linen as opposed to like a chiffon or a crepe, just because a natural fiber will have a lot more grip and it won't be so slippery to work with. This one I'm wearing here is a cotton, and I made this back in 2020 when I was still in the middle of my pattern cutting degree, and since then I've gotten significantly better at sewing and construction, so if I could make it back then, I'm sure you can make this too. I didn't share this project until 2 years ago when I styled it with the Gaia dress, and that's when I started to get requests trickling in about wanting a pattern for this. So this is for those 3 people that requested it. In terms of sizing, I would suggest you pick the size that is closest to your chest measurement and match that with the closest chest measurement under garment measurements. After that, then take the tape measure around your arm and under the armpit, just to make sure that the armhole is big enough, because the way that I have designed this garment is to be relatively close fitting under the armpit. Since there is no fabric here on the front, there will be nothing to hold this down, and if it's too big it will kind of be flapping around a little. And if you do decide to wear this under another item of clothing that has an armhole, you don't want that much fabric to kind of be bunching there. So for this particular pattern, I would suggest you check the actual garment measurements, and those measurements shouldn't have too much ease. Anyway, that's enough for me. Let's get started with the tutorial. Here's everything you need. Some woven and very lightweight fabric, up to 1.5 meters or 1.7 yards for all sizes. It needs to be really lightweight, about a dash away from being borderline see-through is how I would describe it. This is to keep the sleeves tightly sheared, otherwise it might come out longer than you would like. A fabric pen. I really love these iron-off gel pens, as you can actually see the white and it just takes a quick steam to remove. Some shearing elastic. I do buy mine in bulk, but you only need about 1 or 2 bobbins worth. Bias binding. You can make this or use pre-made. I do make mine for this project because I only had white and black on hand, but you can definitely go for a contrasting look like some of my testers. Bear in mind though, if you decide to make your own, it will add a couple of hours to your project. A bias binding maker if you are making it yourself. There are much more in-depth videos about bias binding making out there, but you essentially just cut pieces of fabric on the bias. For this project, I would recommend cutting it at about 3.5 centimeters wide, and then you join them all together at the ends to form one long piece, and then you turn both sides into the center with the right side out and press that down. Start by marking your sleeves with the shirring stitch lines on the right side. If your fabric is sheer enough, you can simply place it over the pattern with the right side up and use a fabric marker to trace the lines. If not, make holes along the paper and make your markings through the holes. Both of the sleeve patterns are the same, one is just a reflection of the other, so I really only had to cut one of the paper patterns out, which is why one of them still has white around the pattern. Share sleeves along the drawn lines. To share, place shirring elastic in the bobbin and regular thread on top. You can either wind it by hand or by machine like I'm doing here, then with the widest stitch length and the tightest tension, so using a straight stitch without pulling on the fabric. If you ever use an iron or fabric marker, steam the sleeves to remove the previously drawn lines. Now we need to French seam the sleeve seams. Pin and sew the first seam wrong sides together. Then trim the seam allowance to about half of that. Be very careful not to cut into the sleeve itself. I like to press the seam to one side and then press it again with the right sides together and that old seam on the very edge. Sew it again with a 0.7 seam allowance encasing the raw edges. Give that seam one final press. Now we finish the hem with a rolled hem. First, turn the hem up on the wrong side by 0.7 centimeters and stitch in the center of the folded section. Whether you trim back the seam allowance here is up to you, but if you do, it does create a neater finish. And then fold it up again by 0.7 centimeters and stitch close to the inside folded edge to secure. Give everything one final press. Now we need to sew a gathering stitch around the crown of the sleeves. Then pull the threads to gather the armhole of the sleeve evenly. After gathering, the sleeve crown should measure roughly the same as the armhole circumference or slightly more. Make sure you repeat steps 1 to 6 for the other sleeve as well. Now we will be constructing the body of the garment. Sew together the front and back pieces at the shoulder and side seams for both layers. Press the seams open. Pin one sleeve into the corresponding armhole of one of the body layers, or whichever layer you have picked to be the outer layer. Do this right sides together. Use the notches to evenly space the gathering. Readjust the gathering here if needed, then sew together at the armholes. Press the armhole seam. Repeat steps 9 to 10 for the other sleeve. Now we need to sew the lining into the armholes with the seam allowance hidden between both body pieces. Turn the piece with the sleeves attached right side out. Place the lining layer inside the outer layer wrong sides together. From one of the underarm sections, rotate the lining inwards so the side seams are exposed. Place the right side of the lining against the wrong side of the sleeve whilst lining up the side seams. Continue to pin around the armhole using the notches to line everything up. Sew all 3 layers together. I completely forgot to film this part, but after you sew this stitch, press the armhole from the right sides to lay it as flat as possible. You will also probably have to make small snips in the underarm seam allowance to release any tension. Open up the lining and outer layer and understitch the armhole seam allowance to the lining layer. Be careful not to catch the outer layer while sewing. Repeat steps 12 to 14 on the other side. Give both armholes a press. Next, we are going to be doing the bias binding. I do have the measurements written here. However, I personally prefer to just trim off the excess when I am done. We are going to be doing the hem of the garment first. Line up both layers at the hem of the garment and pin in place. You want to pin from the center front point all the way to the other side. You can stay stitch this edge using the longest stitch length first if you want to make the next step a little bit easier. Stay stitching will also prevent the edge from stretching whilst you sew. We will be interrupting today's program with an in-depth tutorial showing you how to sew bias binding 2 different ways. If you already know how to sew bias binding, feel very free to skip this section. If you're working with a slippery fabric like I am, I also advise you to increase your stitch length to about 3 or 3.5. This first method is the quote-unquote normal way, and this is how most instructions and tutorials will show you how to do it. First, you want to place your bias binding right sides together with your fabric. Line up that edge and stitch down the first crease like so. Next, you want to fold the binding on the second crease and turn the binding to the wrong side of the fabric. You want to make sure that edge just covers the first line of stitching you made. Pin along the binding as you go. Now come back to the sewing machine and stitch down the binding again from the right side of the fabric. You want to make sure that the binding is being caught on the back. This is what the first method looks like. For the second method, do the same thing as the first one until you go to fold the binding over to the back. Sometimes your bias binding ends up not being wide enough to go all the way around the edge and cover that first line of stitching. If this is the case, instead of unpicking the whole thing and starting again, you can simply sew from the back instead of the front. This ensures that you are catching the entire folded edge, and just sew as closely to that edge as possible. As you can see both lines of stitching at the back, but at the front it looks virtually the same as the first method. This is what both sides looks like from the back and then the front. Back to our regular program. When it comes to bias binding, I'm honestly quite free about it, so I did start to pin it here to that edge, as you can see. However, pinning the silk was making my fingers hurt, so I just said screw it and I went straight into sewing. Because I explained how to do bias binding pretty in-depth in the previous section, I'm not going to go too much in-depth here, but essentially you want to do the bias binding along the entire hem. My bias binding came out a little bit too short. Sometimes this can happen when you stretch it a little bit too much, because as you stretch it, it gets skinnier, but that's fine. We just went in from the back for the second stitch. Trim the binding at the center front so that that corner is sharp again. Now we need to do the other bias binding for the neckline. This one is going to start off a little bit different simply because we have the ties to stitch all in one go. Firstly, you want to mark the middle of your bias binding piece and then line that with the center back. That way your ties will be the same length. Sew that first stitch, but then on the second stitch you want to start at the end of the ties. So to finish the ends, I like to fold it down first and then fold the two sides into the middle, and then folding the entire thing in half. Then stitch from one end of the bias binding across the neckline and down the other tie all the way to the other end of the bias binding. Once again, folding that end the same way that we did the front so that it has a clean finish. Give that bias binding a press and we are officially done. Thank you guys so much for watching. I am sweltering in this heat, so I'm gonna go back to looking like a bum. And thank you to all of my testers for helping me out with this pattern. I appreciate you all so much. If you want to see more patterns and tutorials from me, you should definitely follow me on Instagram and TikTok. Instagram is the first place that I will announce pattern releases, and on the first day I always have a discount. So if you would like to be the first to know about those, definitely follow me on there. Happy sewing, and I will see you all next time.